Hi, this is Matt Baney, managing editor of the Lewiston Tribune, and this is the Lewiston Tribune podcast, episode number 16. I'm here with Laura Guido. Laura covers politics for the Tribune, for the Idaho Press in Nampa, and now for the Coeur d'Alene Press as well, and even some other newspapers. Laura, you're doing a lot of coverage for a lot of people, aren't you?
Yep, it's a big state and it's hard to get reporters all down to Boise, so I'm everyone's eyes and ears.
And we appreciate that. And Laura's busy time is coming up. The Idaho Legislature gets started with their 2025 session on Monday, and Laura has a good primer in Sunday's Tribune about the legislative session. Today is Friday, and earlier today, Laura uh, attended a meeting of some leaders in the legislature as well as Governor Brad Little. And we're going to talk about what to expect from the 2025 legislative session. So, Laura, after meeting with the folks today from the House and the Senate and the governor, um, what are your expectations heading into this year's legislative session?
I think this year is going to see a lot of the issues that we've been kind of seeing the last few years. A major one is going to be this idea of school choice and specifically state funds being allowed to go towards private education. That's divided the legislature in the past, but there's a lot of new faces this year. And uh, there was a lot of spending in the primary election to unseat people who were opposed to those proposals the last couple of years. So I think a lot of supporters of them are thinking that they have the votes this year. But it's still an unknown in terms of if that's something that the legislature will pass. Taxes are also something that comes up every year, and reducing taxes. There's been talk, kind of renewed talk, I guess, about repealing the grocery tax or improving the tax credit. Um, I think Governor Little expressed today some hesitation on totally repealing the grocery tax because he said that, how do you define groceries and or capturing everything sold at the grocery store? Um, and then there's going to be a lot of other things. They they covered a wide range of topics today. Opposing DEI in higher ed. The ITD building, which was a big fight last year. Idaho Launch is the governor's program that he talks about probably the most, which allows high school seniors to kind of seek higher education or training in high demand careers. And yeah, who knows what else will come up.
Always, you can always expect a few curveballs when the legislators all meet down in Boise. So yeah, the school choice one, it does appear as though that's going to be the biggest issue this session, at least going into it. Can you tell us, Laura, what does school funding in Idaho look like right now, and what might it look like if the voucher program is put in place?
So right now, school funding in Idaho over the past 3 years has increased quite a bit, especially during the pandemic. Governor Little really made it a priority to increase the public school funding quite a bit using some of those one-time federal pandemic relief funds. And then there've been moves to kind of increase teacher pay and some of those things. And then the school facility funding bill passed last year to try and put some money towards repairing and building school buildings. Um, it's hard to say what it would look like if one of these proposals passes. I mean, if you talk to like Representative Wendy Horman and Lori Den Hartog, who are the ones kind of proposing probably the main legislation that's going to come forward, which is a tax credit. Their argument is, this money never was in schools. So it's not, not literally taking money out of the public education budget and putting it into private schools, but those who are opposed to it say, well, revenue that we have in our general fund, a lot of that goes towards public schools. So anything that kind of is a big draw on our general fund could potentially affect public schools. That's the biggest state budget that we have is public education. So it's really hard to say how that could shake out.
So that model that you mentioned, it appears as though if something like that were to pass, if parents sent their child to a private school, they would then get a tax credit for doing that. Is that right?
Yeah, it would be a refundable tax credit. And last year, I think the proposal was for about like $8,000 per student. And there's some argument, and this year that's going to be targeted towards lower income families. They haven't obviously I haven't seen a bill yet, so I'm not sure kind of where exactly that threshold is going to be.
But right now and throughout Idaho's history, it all money that went to education went to at the K through 12 level went to public education, didn't go into private hands at all. Is that the case?
Yes, that is the case now, and it's also in the state constitution that money can't go towards like religious schools. However, there have been some Supreme Court cases in other states where the courts have basically said, if you do have these programs that provide money to private schools, you can't exclude religious schools. So, that could become a question in Idaho if in terms of how our constitution is currently written and those previous Supreme Court rulings.
Last session, this came up some, and remind us, did a bill ever get close to being voted on, or did any effort get close on school choice?
So last session, nothing made it out of the committee. I think, in previous years, there wasn't a lot of luck in the education committee. And so this year, the bills went through the Revenue and Tax Committee, and because it was a tax credit program, that was kind of their reasoning for sending it there. And I think to the surprise of some of the supporters, it didn't make it through that committee either. So I don't think anything has made it to the floor except 2 years ago, there was a universal education savings account that went to the Senate floor and was pretty decisively rejected at that point.
Okay. Well, the other thing you mentioned was taxes and tax relief for Idaho taxpayers. A lot of what you reported on in your story and what was discussed, a lot of it was the grocery tax was discussed, perhaps repealing that. And what are kind of the outlines of that proposal? How would the legislature go about perhaps repealing grocery taxes?
Yeah, so I think that's been something that's been kind of tossed around for years now. But it's been sort of renewed because families are dealing with high inflation and their grocery bills are probably pretty high right now. So I'm not sure exactly what it would look like, although I have heard from both Democrats and Republicans that they would support something that would repeal the grocery tax. Governor Little today, though, did say that he could support something, but it would have to have the right parameters, and especially defining groceries, he said it could be a challenge. his example was, if he comes out of Winco and bought a curling iron, which I'm sure is something he uses pretty often. Would that count as groceries because he bought it at Winco? And so, and you start getting into the nitty gritty of like, well, what about alcohol or sodas or,
Mhm.
other things like that, and kind of where do you draw that line? So it'll be interesting to see kind of what comes through. Something else that was discussed is instead of repealing the tax, maybe increasing, Idaho has a tax credit that's supposed to offset the taxes on groceries. And there's been some talk of maybe increasing that instead of repealing the tax itself.
Laura, do you think Brad Little has ever bought a curling iron?
Maybe Teresa needed one. I can't say. I'm not here to judge.
I was quite amused by that quote from Brad Little. Interesting. I wonder how he came up with curling iron when he was thinking of a non-grocery thing he would buy at Winco.
It came to him pretty quickly, so
Maybe he's used that in other settings to talk about this. Um, I going back to education for a second. You also another item that came up was the Idaho Launch Program, which that seems to be one that Brad Little is very proud of. That was kind of a pet project of his, wasn't it, to get that situation in place, right?
yes, I think at every press gathering we've had for the last couple of years, it's been kind of one of the top things he brings up. Um, just kind of for backstory, the program, I believe, started through kind of one-time federal funds during the pandemic when there was a lot of those going around, a smaller version of the program, and it was proved to be pretty popular. And so he really urged the legislature to make it permanent. Um, that came with there was a pretty big fight. I think it passed the House by like one vote or something that 2 years ago when they first made it permanent, and now we're kind of in that second year, and it's it's definitely something that still is popular. A lot of kids signed up for it, but there's still some lawmakers who are not sure that this is how state funds should be used and going towards, higher education or like workforce training.
And in case some folks aren't quite familiar with it, kind of tell us what the Idaho Launch Program does, and maybe what some of the critics any issues they might have with it.
Yeah, so it's a grant that graduating high school seniors can apply for, and they have to kind of meet certain criteria, and one of those criteria is they have to be um, pursuing a career that's considered high demand and or in demand. And there's been some argument over how that's determined. The Idaho Workforce Development Council kind of was in charge of developing that list, and I think they did it based on how many openings there were, and maybe more complicated than that. But they kind of came up with this list, and then there was disagreement over like what's in demand and what we should be funding. And um, for instance, House Speaker Moyle, who's been kind of one of the Mike Moyle, he's been one of the main critics of the program. He said today that he's okay with it continuing, but he's not sure it should go towards like university programs. He thinks it should be really more targeted towards those like 1 to 2 year type training programs, maybe an apprenticeship, career technical education type stuff.
That would this is a question we should ask Mike Moyle, but would that maybe be would the money from the Idaho launch maybe go to a private business that's doing an apprenticeship sort of thing? Would that be your guess, or maybe more of a vo-tech college setting? Is that maybe what he has in mind?
I can't say for sure, but
Right.
I do think that there are private businesses that participate in the program that can be a part of this for if students want to pursue training with them,
Okay.
and there's a cost involved.
Okay. And Laura, then back to taxes. The grocery tax came up a bit, and probably a lot of taxpayers wouldn't mind relief there, but there wasn't a ton of talk about property tax relief at the session today. Is that right? And what was mentioned about potential property tax relief?
It was mentioned. Senator Lori Den Hartog, who's the a new Republican leader on the Senate side. She's the new majority leader. She said that in the Senate, that's really where their priority is. Unfortunately, she didn't really get into the specifics of what exactly they were looking at, but she did mention property taxes as a priority.
And Laura, let me editorialize for a minute. Maybe as a property taxpayer, that's the issue I would love the legislature to do something about. And it seems to me they never do enough about that. Do you sense that's frustration from Idaho voters? And can you sum up for us why it seems the legislature never gets anything done on property tax? This isn't maybe a completely fair question of you, but what's your take on that?
Well, I know that a couple years ago, it had really reached a point to where that it was the top priority of the session. Um, they passed a bill aimed at property tax relief, and it took some of the surplus that we had at the time and some other maneuvering of funding, some sales tax revenue, and that was meant to go kind of back to the voters and be a reduction on their each property tax bill. Um, I think, and then there was a few things tweaked on that this last session. With some of that funding also goes towards like school bonds and levies as a way to reduce those and then further kind of lower people's property tax bills. I will say that the state lawmakers will often point to the fact that they're not the ones setting property taxes and they're not the ones collecting them. It's local government. Um, but local government will say, well, we don't have the money to pay for these things without property taxes. Schools obviously rely really heavily on them. And so some of the things around school facilities were meant to reduce some of that bond and levy burden that a lot of districts are under. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that a lot of the things from the legislation that was passed 2 years ago, some of them like eventually sunset. So there's provisions in there that they kind of go away. The surplus eliminator is one of those. I think we're in the last year of that. So I do think this is going to rise to the top of people's priority lists for a while. I think there was a year where things kind of quieted down. I wasn't hearing about it as much. But I think this year we'll start hearing about it again.
Okay, and one thing that we often hear too is some people want the homestead exemption to be raised. It's allows for on a modest home a lesser property tax bill, but right now that homestead exemption is set at about $150,000 assessed value on the house, and I've heard people say that they would rather see that raised to maybe about 250,000. I guess any guess if that would come up this session?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, again, when this was kind of the top priority, there was talk. So I think they very slightly raised the homeowners exemption with that
Mhm.
bill. The issue a lot of people have is the homeowners exemption used to be kind of indexed, so it would go up as values go up. And at some point that went away. And there was some effort to try and bring that back, try and reindex it. And Representative Bruce Skog, I think, brought something a couple years ago, and several Democrats have said that that's something they think should happen. There was some pushback against that didn't really go anywhere a couple of years ago. There's this concern that, well, if we do that, then the burden shifts to the corporate income, the corporate property tax. Right now, the burden is more on the homeowner side. At least a lot of people have showed me numbers that indicate that it's quite shifted far on the homeowner side. But there's been enough pushback that there hasn't been a lot of momentum on reindexing the homeowner's exemption, but it could come back. Who knows?
Okay. Moving on, some other items that came up was the Medicaid program in Idaho, which was put in place by a voter initiative a few years back. And the legislature has often looked for ways that it might be costing too much money, wasting too much money. What would you expect that debate to look like in the legislature this session?
Yeah, the Medicaid budget is large, so it's always a big topic of debate. A lot of that focus ends up on that Medicaid expansion population, like you said, that was approved by voters. It was in 2018, and then it went into effect in 2020. That program is pretty broadly popular. I mean, it passed by like 60% of the vote, and then I think a more recent polling showed that people approved it at like a 70% rate. So, but there's concern from some people in the legislature that those folks who are in that kind of expansion population, which is kind of supposed to capture the people who didn't qualify for traditional Medicaid, maybe made a little bit too much to qualify for that, but they don't make enough money to really be able to afford some of the state marketplace healthcare. There's concerns that, those people, we should get them off of Medicaid and we should be moving them towards private insurance or the marketplace. So there's always a something trying to repeal it or try and put so many sideboards on it that it really limits the program. There's legal issues with some of those, and then there's also issues where trying to put work requirements on Medicaid programs is difficult to get through the federal government, and it was difficult. The Idaho previously tried under the prior Trump administration, and it never really got anywhere. And then it didn't go, and then it was rejected under the Biden administration. And then now we're going into another Trump presidency, and it'll be interesting to see if they try and put some of those parameters on it again.
Yeah. Something else that we'll probably we'll see a lot of references to this in your stories. DEI will come up and already has come up even before the session with the State Board of Education putting in place a rule that universities in the state aren't allowed to spend money on diversity, equity. I'm sorry, what's the acronym it stand for again?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yeah.
Thank you. And we've already seen that University of Idaho has closed some of its offices that were devoted to DEI. So that's already happened. What would you expect the legislature to do, or what kind of talk have they had about what further could they do about DEI?
Yeah, I asked specifically at that kind of what it was that they're trying to prevent, because one thing I've noticed watching the there's a DEI task force that the legislature convened and has been meeting kind of over this interim. And it's been a challenge to define, they know what the words mean individually, but this concept as a whole, different folks have different interpretations of it. It's still unclear at this point what legislation will look like, but there is something likely to come out of that task force that I mentioned. So I do think they are going to be trying to put some definitions on it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try and codify some of the policies that the Board of Education put into place, just to really solidify, I guess, that this is what they want. And it's really targeted at colleges and universities.
Okay. Yeah, because what the state board did, those were rules, but maybe not, those aren't as quite as well defined as a bill that's passed by the legislature would make, potentially saying that you can't spend money on DEI. That might be a bit more strict than just a state board of ed rule, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's already parameters like within all the budgets that the universities get. They already have rules preventing them from spending on DEI, any state funds. But a lot of the universities value some of these programs, and so if they want to keep those programs, some of them will get private funding and do run the programs without state funds. I think, if I had to guess, the legislature might look to try and limit that activity as well, which they'd have to do through a bill instead of just through the budgets, which can only really dictate how they use the state funds.
Okay. And then immigration came up in the meeting today, Laura, and of course, the one way this could affect Idaho is, the dairy industry, a huge industry in southern Idaho, could potentially be affected. It relies on undocumented workers, and what action might the legislature take on immigration, and how might it affect Idaho industries?
Yeah, there were a few things mentioned today. One of them, I think, last year there was a bill that was brought up in the House that didn't make it through. It might have passed the House, but it didn't make it through the full legislature. That was similar to a bill passed in Texas that would pretty much get local law enforcement a little more involved. Like if they caught an undocumented person committing a crime, then that person would get deported. The Texas law has been kind of under litigation in terms of like, is that more of the federal purview, or is that something states can do? But Moyle said that something like that's probably going to come back. There might be legislation to require businesses to use something called E-Verify, which is just supposed to verify people's status to work in the US. There's other legislation probably going to deal with like if someone's pulled over and they find out they're undocumented, then they would impound the car. That was something that Moyle also brought up. So I think there's going to be a number of bills introduced this session that deal with this.
Okay. Okay, Laura, any other issues come up today that we haven't chatted about that are maybe worth visiting for a second, or any other legislative things that come to your mind that we might keep an eye on during the session?
One thing that I didn't really go into in my story because I didn't have any details, but the Governor Little did say that Monday, during his State of the State, that folks can tune in for what he described as a election integrity surprise. So there's going to be something to do with election integrity. He didn't give too many details today because he didn't want to scoop his own state of the state. So I think there'll be quite a few things that come up tomorrow that we didn't get to hear about today. So, I mean, not tomorrow, on Monday.
Well, he's I guess he's setting the stage. He's being a good showman to get everybody to tune into it. And the state of the state will be at 1 p.m. Mountain Time, noon Pacific on Monday. And you'll be there to cover that. And that's always the kickoff of the session. So you'll have a story from that. Okay, Laura, thanks for your insight on the state legislature. And now a little bit of a topic change. Earlier this week, you wrote about the death of former President Jimmy Carter and his maybe kind of unexpected, unusual tie to the state of Idaho. And people who are a little younger and maybe newcomers to Idaho might not have realized just how many ties Jimmy Carter, Georgia president from Georgia, had to Idaho. Tell us about some of those connections and just what you learned writing that story.
Yeah, so before he was elected as president, when he won the Democratic nomination, Carter was considering the then Senator Frank Church as his vice president. Church had run against him in the primary and done fairly well. I mean, I think he won a handful of states, a few states maybe. So he was kind of naturally in contention for that as someone who also had a high profile. He didn't before, but his primary kind of elevated his national profile. I did talk to the former editor of the Lewiston Tribune, who had been reporting on it. One thing just that I found interesting was he apparently got sent to New York to cover like the convention, or at least when I was reading his old reporting, I was like, wow, that's not something that happens frequently now.
It's a little different world back then. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
quite what we do nowadays. Yeah.
And then, when he did win the presidency, he did select then Idaho Governor Cecil D. Andrews. And Andrews served as the Secretary of the Interior. And, I think a lot of people are aware of, the major wilderness areas in Idaho. And one of them is named after Frank Church. And so the three of them, I guess, we're all pretty involved in the creation of that. Although it was Ronald Reagan that renamed it after Frank Church when he got cancer. So it was pretty interesting learning about this because it was a time when Idaho had some pretty prominent leaders, and they were Democrats, and that's something that hasn't happened in a very long time since.
Yeah, I agree. It's just strange to think of a time when Idaho played such a prominent role on the national stage, and that just, isn't the case nowadays. And I'm not sure why, but the stars seem to align back in the mid 70s, and another aspect of that was Jimmy Carter when he was the sitting president coming to Idaho to raft on the Salmon River. And you can tell in the old stories that we ran what a logistical nightmare that must have been for the Secret Service. And it's funny now. I can't imagine that a president these days would be allowed to do that. It's hard to picture Joe Biden or Donald Trump rafting down the Salmon River these days.
Well, and I don't know if you've ever been on the Middle Fork, but I've been lucky enough that I've gotten to do that stretch with my family. And a lot of Idaho's remote, but that's very, very remote. And they only did 3 days of it. You can do, a whole week if you want out there, but it's I imagine, I'd also like to picture the kind of string of staff and reporters and Secret Service people who had to be in the rafts all behind him. And you're in these steep canyons, and I imagine security was a challenge.
It just, yeah, it's just fascinating to think of that. And I mean, Idaho now, hardly ever has a sitting president come here at all. I think probably George W. Bush was the last sitting president that came to Idaho. I don't think, I could be mistaken, but I don't think we've had an appearance by a president since then. Um, so anyway, that was interesting. I had kind of heard about some of these details about Frank Church as a vice presidential candidate potentially, and Cecil Andrus and Jimmy Carter's raft trip, but it was interesting to read all of that too. And as you mentioned, quite a different world. Prominent Democrats from Idaho being on the national stage. I don't think we're going to see that this year at least.
I think that's safe to say.
Well, Laura, hey, thank you for your time, and thanks for the preview of the legislative session. And enjoy your weekend, because you better hunker down now. You've got a lot of work ahead of you documenting the legislature this session.
I can't wait.
Very good. And thanks for everybody for tuning in to the Tribune podcast. We'll be back again next week with a new topic. And until then, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.